So I'm going to cover a few highlights of the rare disease provisions in the user fee draft, some of which Remy hinted towards in her talk. And we know that these provisions will go a long way towards solving the tough regulatory challenges that are faced by the rare disease community. Due to time, I'm going to keep it fairly high level. But I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, to visit the RDLA's website to view a recording of last week's RDLA monthly webinar, where we do get into a little bit more detail on some of the additional provisions in the House draft. After, I'm going to also talk about a few enhancements that we think can really strengthen the bill's ability to close that innovation gap for rare disease. So let's dive in. Next slide. Perfect. Okay. So in the House draft, you'll find a few themes that occur throughout the rare disease related provisions. And as you know, one of the ways the user fee bill shapes policy is by calling for the FDA and agencies like the GAO to conduct studies, hold workshops that often then lead to guidance documents or reports to Congress with other policy recommendations. And this user fee, we saw these calls for studies, workshops, guidances, and reports centered around themes like how FDA engages with external experts, what we can do to better understand small population differences, and how we can learn from EU models for rare drug evaluation, and then also tackling challenges related to endpoint development and more. So I'm not going to go through each individual provision, but again, I encourage you to tune in to dive in a little bit deeper to the RDLA webinar. So you can go on to the next slide. Perfect. So the user fee bill also authorizes several new programs, some of which Remy mentioned, and expands or reauthorizes and expands the several existing programs, such as the Orphan Drug Grant Program. It also clarifies authorities, in this case, a change to how the FDA provides exclusivity to rare disease drugs. So you can go, we're going to dive into some of this a little bit more in just a moment. Awesome. So while not directly rare disease related, it is very relevant to rare. It's not solely relevant to rare, I should say, but the House draft also includes several important reforms to the accelerated approval pathway. The reforms to the accelerated approval pathway in the House bill include several changes to the requirements for confirmatory trials, for when those confirmatory trial conversations happen. They also have changes related to how the withdrawal process will work. We have been talking about many barriers to using the accelerated approval pathway for rare disease communities, and the reforms in the user fee bill focus mainly on those downstream issues rather than some of the upstream issues that are really critical to unleashing the potential of the pathway for rare diseases. But nonetheless, they are important reforms, and we are working actively to engage in making sure that they can truly benefit the rare disease community. Go ahead to the next slide. Great. So what we're really focused on talking about today is what rare disease priorities we're missing. The user fee bill is a must-pass piece of legislation, and as Remy mentioned, it can become a vehicle for advancing other policies that communities have been working on in the years between the reauthorizations. And unfortunately, the initial draft does not include two very important policy priorities that you have heard or us as Every Life Foundation talk about, but also our many partner organizations, one of which you will hear from just after me, and that is the Benefit Act. But I'm going to focus on the Speeding Therapy Access Today Act. You can go to the next slide. So while we were disappointed that there may not yet be the consensus in Congress needed to establish the Rare Disease Center of Excellence, which is sort of the cornerstone of the STAT Act, we will still move the needle forward for those 93 to 95% of rare diseases that have no approved therapies. So we know that we need solutions now, and waiting 5 5 years for another reauthorization is simply not acceptable and not an option for for any rare disease patient or family member. So what we have done is taken a look at the STAT Act and thought about several ways that we can advance policy, enhance the existing draft, and advocate as a community for some feasible enhancements to this year's PDUFA bill. And those fall in areas such as advancing solutions for ultra-rare small population therapeutic development, facilitating earlier exchange of product information with payers prior to approval, and establishing a rare disease and condition advisory committee. And all three of these pieces have been pulled together from components of the STAT Act. So we're going to take one by one. You can go to the next slide. So first is really how can we, again, focus on understanding those small population challenges, whether it's individualized medical products, ultra rare, small population challenges. You may hear many different terms used, but bottom line is we know that there is an additional set of challenges that they have to bring a therapy through the development and regulatory process. And we know that everyone agrees it's hard and it's complicated, but we also agree that just stopping there is not enough. We have to invest in finding solutions. And one of the programs the FDA has set up to do research, to fund external research, is the Orphan Drug Grant Program. Currently, that program is authorized to provide grant support for natural history studies as well as rare disease clinical trial work. And within the STAT Act, the Altitude program, which is the overarching program designed to focus on ultra-rare challenges, includes an expansion of the Orphan Drug Grant Program. And what we would like to see that applied to the user fee agreement. And indeed, it was included, a version of it was included in the House draft. And what you see in the quotes is exactly that language. And the expansion will cover regulatory science pertaining to the chemistry, manufacturing, regulatory approval, and controls of individualized medical products. And this allows the FDA to fund innovative regulatory science work that is really focused on the toughest challenges that are out there. And we were really pleased to see that in the House draft. And so here, what our focus is making sure that that language ends up in the final bill. It is not in the Senate draft currently. And that we also work with our champions to increase the authorization level for that program because they consistently receive more fundable research than they're able to fund with the existing resources. And so we need to increase that authorization level so that we can come together as a community and support broader appropriations as well. So next slide. And the next piece we want to focus on that we think can make a big difference is facilitating earlier engagement or exchange of information with payers prior to approval. We know that rare disease patients often face delays accessing a treatment, after it has been approved, and it's often a long process to provide information that payers can review and understand and use to determine their coverage policies. And they often don't have access to the full slate of information that the FDA has used to make their approval decisions. And that can lead to not only increasing delays, but coverage policies that are not going to get the full benefit of the treatment for the eligible population. And so the STAT Act calls for the creation of a voluntary third-party payer program that would facilitate this type of communication. And the House draft, it also includes some related provisions. So in Section 810, it includes a provision that would permit the exchange of information with payers prior to approval. It lays out details on what type of information can be exchanged and when, what type of communications shouldn't be had, and more. And so we feel that this, combined with the FDA's the CDRH Payer Communication Task Force, really shows that there's a deep recognition of the need to facilitate this communication between sponsors and payers, and ultimately shorten the timeline between FDA approval for clearance and coverage decisions. So we know that it's very important to ensure that throughout this process, the statutory role of the FDA is upheld. And we think that we can do that through this voluntary early payer mechanism, just as CDRH has been doing with their payer task force. And so here our request is that we add language that extends that CDRH payer communication task force to bridge across CDER and CBER in the final user fee bill. Next slide. And last of the three is the Rare Disease and Condition Advisory Committee that is called for in the STAT Act. And we believe wholeheartedly that there is a need for this type of broad rare disease and condition advisory committee. We know that one of the reasons why we are calling for a center of excellence for rare disease is that it occurs in all three medical product centers, and there's capacity even beyond the FDA, beyond those three medical product centers to leverage for the benefit of rare disease patients. We know that it is impossible with over 7,000 rare diseases identified that FDA can have internal expertise on the myriad of challenges facing rare disease therapeutic development in different categories. And for those, it's certainly impractical for them to have internal expertise on every single disease area. We know that FDA can identify external experts to engage on an ad hoc basis, but they have no standing body to return to on tough regulatory science issues in rare or to help supplement the advisory committee expertise. And so that is why we are reiterating our belief that we need a rare disease and condition advisory committee that would consider regulatory pathways, clinical trial design needs, biomarker issues, drug repurposing, other issues related to drug review process and rare. One important clarification, it would not be charged with individual product review discussions, but its members could convene with such committees to supplement their expertise as needed. And we know that, again, just like with the payer program, it is modeled after similarly structured committees, such as the Pediatric Advisory Committee, which is not a specific drug area AdCom, but rather provides that cross-cutting policy issues. So together, these three pieces of the STAT Act we feel are feasible, practical, should be fairly consensus-based issues. And we think that the time is now, the time to act is now. And again, while we may not yet have consensus on the need for a center of excellence in this user fee agreement, we believe that if we can rally the rare disease community to embrace these three provisions out of the STAT Act, that in some cases, 2 out of the 3 cases align with existing provisions in the House draft that just need to be enhanced, that we can truly make a big impact. And we need to remind everyone on the true impact of rare disease on the rare disease family, the patients, the family members, in addition, of course, to society at large, and the cost that we can, the cost in the health and emotional impacts that we can improve if we just come together and invest in finding solutions for rare disease therapeutic development. So thank you. I look forward to questions and hearing from our other speakers.